The room was silent, yet it felt deafening. My fingers traced the lace hem of the wedding dress, trembling slightly. I was alone, surrounded by the faint scent of roses and white linen. Outside, laughter and muffled chatter echoed through the walls, a celebration waiting for its grand crescendo. My wedding day. I exhaled slowly, staring at my reflection. Was that really me? The girl in the mirror looked too serene for the storm that was brewing inside. I should have been happy. Instead, my stomach twisted in anxious knots I couldn't explain. Then the door burst open. Emma. Her voice cracked as she said my name, soft, broken, yet too loud in this sacred moment. I turned, and there she was, Lily, my best friend. Her face was pale, her hands fidgeting as though trying to grasp onto something invisible for support. Lily? I asked, forcing a smile that felt brittle. Is everything okay? She took 2 uneven steps forward. Her lips quivered as if the words she was holding back would tear her apart if she kept them in any longer. And then she blurted it out. I'm pregnant. The air left my lungs like I'd been hit by a train. My mind fumbled for reason, for meaning behind those 2 words. Pregnant? My heart raced, an instinctive cocktail of joy and shock until... I don't understand, I whispered, staring at her. Why are you telling me this now? Lily's face twisted with something raw, shame. Her eyes glistened with tears, and she pressed a hand to her stomach. I needed to tell you before you walked down that aisle. Her voice cracked. I stood frozen, the room growing colder with every passing second. My skin felt too tight for my body. This doesn't make sense. The words spilled out, desperate. I needed it not to make sense. I needed this to be some horrible misunderstanding. Who's the father? Her sob was the only answer I got. My chest tightened, an unbearable pressure mounting as I searched her face for the truth I already feared. Lily, who? My voice was rising, a crescendo of dread. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat too long. When they opened, she was drowning, and she pulled me into that abyss with one whispered name. Ethan. For a second, the world went silent. Then it shattered. My legs felt like they would give out. The room spun, the air thick and suffocating. I heard myself breathe, ragged and shallow, as if the simple act of inhaling had become impossible. No. I shook my head slowly, stepping back as if that would put distance between me and the wreckage she dropped at my feet. No, that can't be. You're lying. She crumbled, falling to her knees, the weight of her truth too heavy to bear standing. I didn't mean for it to happen. I didn't. Her voice broke completely. I stared down at her, my oldest friend. My sister in everything but blood. I wanted to scream, to shake her, to claw the truth out of her and bury it where it could never hurt me again. But I was locked in place. Everything blurred. Lily's sobs, the wedding gown hanging like a ghost behind me, the guests just outside the door who had no idea that my world had just collapsed. All I could hear was my pulse, a drumbeat of betrayal, pounding in my ears. How long? My voice was barely a whisper, but she heard me. Her shoulders shook as she answered. Since last summer. Since last summer. The words echoed through me, hollow and brutal. That was when Ethan had been distant. Work trips, excuses, late-night calls. Every unanswered question, every doubt I'd silenced for the sake of love came rushing back like a tidal wave. I had asked him once if something was wrong. He'd kissed my forehead and told me I worried too much. Now I knew the truth. The truth tasted bitter on my tongue. I should have felt grief, but all I felt in that moment was rage. Searing, hot rage that burned away the last shred of innocence I'd carried. I took a step toward Lily. She flinched as though she thought I might strike her. I didn't. I just stared down at her, at the girl who had been part of every memory I held dear, now reduced to a stranger draped in betrayal. How could you? I asked, not expecting an answer, but needing to say it aloud, needing her to feel the weight of her crime. I loved him too, she whispered. Something inside me snapped. My voice was no longer soft. You loved him? You loved him? You knew what he meant to me, and you still—" My throat closed. Words couldn't hold the enormity of this betrayal. Tears streamed down her face. "Emma, please. I didn't want this. I never wanted to hurt you." I didn't answer. My mind raced through fragments of memories, the way Ethan's eyes would linger when he thought I wasn't looking, the moments Lily and I would laugh about how perfect he was, all those fragile moments now twisted beyond recognition. I turned away, my hands clenched so tightly my nails dug into my palms. "You should leave." She hesitated. "Emma, get out." Her breath hitched. I felt her behind me for a second longer before the door clicked shut. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood alone in that room, still wrapped in white satin and roses, surrounded by shattered dreams. My reflection stared back at me with empty eyes. Today was supposed to be the beginning of a new life. Instead, it was the end of one. And I knew this was only the beginning of something else, something darker. I still remember the first time I saw Ethan, clear as if it were yesterday, though it feels like a lifetime ago. It wasn't the kind of story you read about in books, where everything slows down and fireworks light the sky. No, it was something quieter, something that seeped into me slowly, like the warmth of the morning sun after a cold night. We met at a cafe near campus. I had gone there to escape the chaos of finals, armed with a lukewarm latte and a stack of notes I barely touched. The place was almost empty, save for the barista wiping down the counter and a guy with messy hair sitting a few tables away, flipping through a book. I didn't notice him at first, not until he looked up from his page, caught me staring blankly at my notes, and smiled. A crooked, boyish smile that somehow felt like a secret between us. "Long day?" he asked, his voice light but warm. I blinked, caught off guard. "Something like that?" He closed his book and stood, walking over to my table. I should have felt awkward, maybe even annoyed at the interruption. But I didn't. He had this ease about him, as if he belonged in every room he walked into. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. I shrugged, and he took that as a yes, sliding into the seat across from me. His presence felt strange at first, like an unexpected plot twist in my otherwise uneventful afternoon. But within minutes, he had me laughing. A real laugh, the kind I hadn't let out in days. "Ethan," he said, extending his hand after we joked about the horror of final exams. "Emma," I replied, shaking it. His hand was warm, steady. From that moment, it felt like we were orbiting each other. A few more chance encounters at the cafe turned into planned ones. Coffee became long walks around campus, lazy afternoons at the library where we'd study, but mostly distract each other with whispered jokes. He was different from anyone I'd met. Charming, but not in a way that felt rehearsed. He had this quiet thoughtfulness, a way of listening that made you feel like you were the only person in the world. Our first real date wasn't anything extravagant. We grabbed burgers from a food truck and sat on a hill overlooking the city. The sky was painted in streaks of orange and pink, the sun dipping below the horizon. I remember leaning back, feeling the grass beneath my hands and the breeze in my hair. "You know," Ethan said, glancing at me, "I think you might be the smartest person I've ever met." I laughed, rolling my eyes. "Is that your attempt at flattery?" He grinned. "No, just the truth." I didn't know what to say to that. No one had ever made me feel seen like that before, as though he wasn't just noticing me, but really seeing me. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It felt full, like words would have only cheapened the moment. When the stars began to appear, he reached for my hand, threading his fingers through mine. My heart skipped, and I realized in that quiet, unassuming moment that I was falling for him. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was soft, steady, inevitable. The months that followed felt like a dream. We were inseparable, spending hours talking about everything and nothing. He knew how to make me feel safe, even when the world felt too loud. I introduced him to Lily a few months in, and they hit it off immediately. I'd always worried that introducing a boyfriend to my best friend might feel strange, but with them, everything was easy, natural. I remember the first time he told me he loved me. It was pouring rain, one of those summer storms that hit out of nowhere. We had run for cover under a bus stop, soaked to the bone but laughing like kids. My hair was plastered to my face, and I was shivering. He reached out, tucking a wet strand behind my ear, and just stared at me for a moment. "I love you," he said, as simple and certain as if he'd said my name. I froze, the words sinking into me like rain soaking into dry earth. You do?" He nodded, his eyes soft. "I've loved you for a while now. I just couldn't keep it in anymore." Tears welled in my eyes, not from sadness, but from something so overwhelming it left me breathless. I threw my arms around his neck, and he laughed, spinning me despite the rain. "I love you too," I whispered against his shoulder. From that moment, our lives intertwined even more tightly. We spent holidays together, lazy Sundays wrapped in blankets watching old movies, spontaneous road trips to nowhere just because we wanted to escape. He wasn't just my boyfriend, he became my home, my safe harbor. When he proposed 2 years later, it felt inevitable, like the next chapter of a book you've been dying to read. We were on a weekend trip to the mountains, the air crisp and filled with the scent of pine. We'd hiked to a clearing with a breathtaking view of the valley below. I was busy taking pictures when I turned around and found him on one knee. "Emma," he began, his voice steady but his eyes shimmering with nerves and something deeper. "You're my best friend, my partner, my everything. I can't imagine my life without you. Will you marry me?" I didn't even let him finish. "Yes," I blurted, half laughing, half crying as I knelt down with him. The ring was simple, elegant, a silver band with a small sapphire, but it wasn't the ring that mattered. It was him. It was the life we were about to build together. For a long time, I believed our love was unbreakable, that what we had was rare, something people spent their whole lives searching for. I thought we were the lucky ones. Looking back now, I see the cracks that I missed, or chose to ignore. But in that moment, on that mountain, with Ethan's arms wrapped around me and the world stretched out beneath us, I didn't see anything but forever. The first time I felt it, that cold, creeping doubt, I told myself it was nothing. A bad day. A misunderstanding. I clung to every excuse like a lifeline because the alternative was too painful to admit. It started with small things, like the way he began checking his phone more often during dinner. He used to leave it face up, never worried about notifications. But now, he'd flip it over as if it held secrets I wasn't meant to see. I noticed the change, of course. How could I not? But I told myself not to be that girl, the paranoid fiancé who reads too much into things. So I kept quiet. Then came the late nights. "I have to stay late at work," Ethan would say, his voice casual but lacking the warmth it used to carry. "There's a deadline coming up." At first, I believed him without question. He was ambitious and dedicated. Those were things I loved about him. But then the late nights turned into weekend trips. Business meetings, conferences, reasons that seemed too convenient, too frequent. The first real fight we had was over one of those weekends. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through social media, watching other couples post photos of their lazy Sundays together. Pancakes, movies, walks in the park. Meanwhile, I was alone, again. When Ethan finally walked in, his shirt slightly wrinkled, I looked up from my phone. "You're back," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. He kicked off his shoes and dropped his bag by the door. "Yeah. Long trip. You could have called." Ethan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Emma, we've talked about this. Work's been insane." I set my phone down and stood. I'm not asking for a novel-length update, just a message? Something to let me know you're okay. His face hardened, a look that had become more familiar in recent months. "I don't need to check in with you every second." His words stung, sharp and sudden. "I'm not asking for that." I struggled to keep my voice steady. "But don't you see how distant you've been?" Ethan's eyes met mine, but there was something guarded in them, as if he'd already decided this wasn't his fault. "I'm not distant. You're just being sensitive." Sensitive. The word felt like a slap. He used to admire how in tune I was with my emotions. Now it felt like a flaw he was pointing out. "That's not fair," I whispered. "We're supposed to be a team. But lately, it feels like I'm the only one holding us together, He stepped closer, placing his hands on my shoulders in what was supposed to be a reassuring gesture, but it felt patronizing. "You're overthinking it. I love you. You know that." I nodded, but my heart felt heavy. His words were what I wanted to hear, but they didn't feel like the truth anymore. Not the way they used to. Things didn't change after that fight. If anything, they got worse. Ethan became more distracted, more distant. The warmth that once defined our relationship had been replaced by a polite coldness, like we were strangers living in the same house. I tried to tell myself it was just a rough patch, that every couple goes through ups and downs. But then came the night that solidified my worst fears. It was a Friday evening, and Ethan was supposed to be home hours ago. I had planned a quiet dinner, just the two of us. I lit candles, set the table, and put on the soft jazz playlist he always said he loved. I wanted to remind him of what we had, of what was worth fighting for. But as the minutes dragged into hours, the candles burned low, their wax pooling onto the tablecloth. I tried calling him, but each call went straight to voicemail. I texted once, then twice. Nothing. By the time the door finally opened, it was past midnight. Ethan walked in, his hair disheveled, the faint scent of cologne mixed with something unfamiliar clinging to him. "Where have you been?" I asked, unable to mask the hurt in my voice. He paused, as if calculating his answer. "Out with the team. We grabbed drinks after work." "For 6 hours?" I crossed my arms, my pulse pounding in my ears. "You didn't answer your phone." His jaw tightened. "My phone died." "Really?" I laughed bitterly, the sound foreign even to me. "How convenient." He dropped his keys onto the counter with a metallic clink. "What do you want me to say, Emma? I'm exhausted. I'm not in the mood for an interrogation." I felt something inside me crack. "I don't want an interrogation either, Ethan. I want honesty. I want to feel like I matter to you." His eyes darkened, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he looked at me like I was the problem, like I was the one destroying what we'd built. "I don't know what you want from me anymore," he muttered before walking past me. The sound of our bedroom door closing behind him felt final. I stood there, staring at the empty space he left behind, my heart twisting with doubt and something far more painful: suspicion. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, memories flashing like a cruel slideshow. Our first date, our laughter, the way he used to hold my hand like he never wanted to let go. When had it all started slipping away? And why couldn't I stop it? By morning, I had convinced myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I really was overthinking things. But then, as I made the bed, something caught my eye: his phone, charging on the nightstand. I hesitated. My heart warred with my conscience. Ethan had never given me a reason to go through his phone before. But now? Now, there were 100 unanswered questions and too many signs I couldn't ignore. My fingers hovered over the screen. One swipe, and it unlocked. He'd never bothered with a password, trusting me completely. Or maybe never expecting I'd doubt him. At first, there was nothing suspicious. Just the usual messages from coworkers and group chats. But then I saw it. A text thread under a name I didn't recognize. Lily. My stomach twisted as I tapped it open. My best friend's name. Why hadn't I noticed it before? The texts were vague, but damning in their simplicity. "Can't wait to see you. Last night was incredible. Miss you already." My breath caught in my throat and the room spun. I reread the messages, hoping I'd misunderstood, that there was some innocent explanation I wasn't seeing. But no matter how many times I stared at those words, they stayed the same, unforgiving and real. I dropped the phone like it had burned me. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out everything else. In that moment, I felt something fragile inside me shatter completely. This wasn't just a bad day or a rough patch. This was betrayal, creeping in like a shadow I'd tried to pretend wasn't there. And for the first time, I knew with terrifying clarity that things between us were broken in a way I couldn't fix. The sound of the door clicking shut still echoed in my mind as I stood there, motionless. The world outside that room continued to spin, guests laughing, music playing, the hum of life moving forward. But for me, Everything had come to a halt. The weight of betrayal crushed me from the inside, hollowing out my chest until I felt nothing but emptiness. I didn't cry. Not yet. The tears felt stuck somewhere deep inside, too raw to surface. I couldn't stay here, not in this room filled with the ghost of my wedding. The dress felt suffocating, clinging to my skin like a cruel reminder of everything I had lost in a single, unforgiving moment. I grabbed my phone with shaking fingers and called a taxi. I didn't think, didn't plan. I just knew I had to leave. When the driver arrived, I barely registered his polite greeting as I slid into the back seat. The car pulled away from the venue, taking me farther from the life I thought I was about to start. "Where to?" the driver asked, glancing at me through the rearview mirror. "The lake," I whispered. He didn't question it. I was grateful for the silence as we drove through familiar streets that blurred past in a haze. My thoughts were tangled, a chaotic storm of memories and pain. Ethan's smile, Lily's tears, the texts, the lies. It was like watching the story of someone else's life unravel, but it was mine. The car came to a slow stop at the edge of the old trail that led to the lake. I handed the driver some cash without even counting it and stepped out, feeling the cool evening air wrap around me. The quiet out here was different from the silence in that room. It didn't suffocate me. It felt calm. The lake had always been my refuge. I came here to think, to breathe, to remember who I was when the world became too loud. Tonight, it felt like the only place where I could fall apart in peace. The path crunched beneath my heels as I made my way toward the water's edge. I kicked off my shoes once I reached the soft grass, letting the earth ground me. The lake shimmered under the faint light of the moon, its surface still and reflective. I let out a long, shaky breath and sank to the ground, pulling my knees to my chest. Finally, the tears broke free. Silent at first, then uncontrollable, like a dam bursting. I cried for the love I'd lost, for the trust that had been shattered, and for the woman I'd been just hours ago, naive, hopeful, blind. I was so lost in my grief that I didn't notice the man sitting a few feet away until he spoke. "Rough night?" His voice was low, gentle, but it startled me. I wiped my face hastily and turned. He was sitting cross-legged on the grass, wearing a dark coat. His hair was slightly messy, and there was a quiet calm about him as he gazed out over the water. "Gee, I didn't see you there," I muttered, trying to compose myself. He offered a small, understanding smile. "You looked like you needed some space. I figured it was better not to interrupt." I nodded, unsure of what to say. Part of me wanted to be alone, but another part, the part that was breaking, felt oddly comforted by his presence. "You come here often?" he asked after a moment. "Yeah," I whispered. "It's my place, or at least it used to be." I paused, then added, "I'm Emma, by the way." "Daniel." He extended his hand, and I shook it lightly. We sat in silence for a while, the kind that doesn't feel awkward, just two strangers, caught in the same quiet moment. "What about you?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "Why are you here?" Daniel exhaled slowly. "I come here when I need to clear my head. There's something about the water. It makes things feel smaller, less overwhelming." I stared out at the rippling surface, the moonlight catching on its edges like silver veins. "I thought tonight was supposed to be the best day of my life," I murmured. The words felt bitter on my tongue. Daniel looked at me thoughtfully, but didn't press. "Weddings," he said, almost to himself. "They come with a lot of expectations." I let out a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah, especially when your fiancé gets your best friend pregnant." His eyes widened slightly before softening with sympathy. "Damn," he said quietly. "That's a lot." "Yeah." My voice cracked, and I hugged my knees tighter. I keep thinking I should have seen it. There must have been signs, right? But I ignored them. I kept telling myself that I was just overthinking things. I trusted them both more than I trusted my own instincts. Daniel nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "Sometimes, we believe in people because we want so badly for the story to end a certain way. It's not your fault." I swallowed hard, blinking back another wave of tears. It feels like it is. It's not, he repeated, more firmly this time. Some people are just selfish. That doesn't mean you're weak for loving them. It means you're strong enough to believe in love, even when it's hard. His words hit me in a way I didn't expect. I felt something shift inside me, not enough to erase the pain, but enough to make the weight of it just a little more bearable. I looked over at him, studying the quiet sadness in his eyes. "What about you?" I asked softly. "Why are you really here, Daniel?" He hesitated, then sighed. "I was supposed to get married last year." His voice was steady, but there was a heaviness beneath it. "She called it off a week before the wedding, said she wasn't ready. I didn't see it coming either." I felt a strange pang of understanding, a shared wound. "I'm sorry," I whispered. He shook his head, a small, wistful smile on his lips. "It's okay. I've made peace with it. Mostly." We sat there, two strangers bound by different but familiar losses. The night stretched on around us, serene and endless. "Emma," Daniel said after a long pause, "you deserve better than someone who couldn't see what he had in you. Don't forget that." I closed my eyes, letting his words settle over me like a blanket against the cold. For the first time all night, I felt a flicker of warmth, faint but real. "Thank you," I whispered. Daniel nodded, and we lapsed back into silence, the kind that felt more like healing than absence. The lake continued to shimmer, unaware of the hearts it was quietly mending. The days after the wedding that never was passed in a blur. I floated through them like a ghost, going through the motions, but feeling nothing inside. I didn't cry anymore, but it wasn't because I'd healed. It was because I'd run out of tears. My world had gone gray. Every love song I used to hum felt like a cruel reminder. Every happy couple on the street felt like a jab to the heart. But there was one place that still felt like mine, the lake. I kept going back there, as if the water could somehow wash away everything I'd been through. And every week, Daniel was there too. It became an unspoken ritual. Every Saturday, around sunset, we'd find each other by the water's edge. Sometimes we talked, sometimes we didn't. The silence between us felt comforting rather than awkward, a shared understanding of wounds too deep for words. He'd ask me how I was doing, and I'd answer honestly. Not the polite "I'm fine" you give to people who don't really want to know. With Daniel, I could say things like, "I feel like I'm stuck in quicksand," or "I don't know if I'll ever trust anyone again." And he'd listen without trying to fix it, which was exactly what I needed. One evening, a month after that night at the lake, I arrived at our usual spot to find Daniel already there. But this time, something was different. A soft blanket was spread out on the grass, and next to it was a wicker basket. He stood when he saw me, a small, sheepish grin on his face. "What's this?" I asked, raising an eyebrow, but unable to hide my curiosity. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck, looking almost shy. "I figured we've spent enough time brooding here. Thought it was time for something lighter." He reached into the basket and pulled out a bottle of red wine, followed by a small spread of cheeses, grapes, and crackers. It looked like something out of a romantic picnic scene from a movie. My chest tightened with something that felt dangerously close to hope. "You didn't have to do this," I murmured, though a smile tugged at the corners of my lips. "I know." He met my eyes, his expression serious. "But I wanted to." I hesitated for a second, then nodded and sat down on the blanket. He poured 2 glasses of wine, handing one to me. The glass felt cool in my hand as I swirled the wine, watching the deep red hue catch the fading light of the sunset. "To new beginnings?" he offered, raising his glass. I hesitated again, the phrase feeling fragile in my chest. But then I nodded and clinked my glass gently against his. "To new beginnings." We sipped in silence for a moment, the crisp taste of the wine warming my throat. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and water, and I let myself sink into the moment, the first truly peaceful one I'd had in weeks. Daniel reached for a cluster of grapes and popped one into his mouth before offering some to me. I took one, feeling the sweetness burst on my tongue. He laughed when I made an exaggerated sound, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I laughed too. Really laughed. "This is nice," I admitted, leaning back on my elbows. I forgot what it felt like to just enjoy something. Daniel lay back beside me, his face tilted up toward the sky. Me too. We watched the sky fade from orange to deep purple, stars beginning to wink into view. I turned my head slightly to look at him, noticing how the starlight caught in his eyes. There was a softness in the way he looked at the sky, a quiet peace that made me feel safe. "Thank you for this," I said softly. He turned his head toward me, his face inches from mine. "You don't have to thank me, Emma." For a moment, we just stared at each other, the air between us charged with something unspoken but undeniable. My pulse quickened, and I felt that familiar wall rise in my mind, the one that told me to be careful, to keep my distance, to never let anyone in again. But there, in the quiet of the lake and the warmth of his gaze, I felt something else too, a choice. He reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair behind my ear, his fingertips grazing my cheek. My breath caught in my throat. I felt the warmth of his touch spread like a slow fire through my veins. "Emma." His voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't think. I didn't let fear make the choice for me. I closed the distance between us, pressing my lips to his. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, two people testing the fragile bridge they'd just built. But as his hand slid to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, the hesitation melted away. His kiss was steady, grounding, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel broken. I felt whole. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite name, something between awe and tenderness. "I didn't plan for this," I murmured, my fingers still resting lightly on his chest. Daniel smiled, his hand brushing gently over mine. "Neither did I. But maybe that's okay." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle over me. Maybe it was okay. Maybe I didn't have to have everything figured out. Maybe letting someone in again wasn't a betrayal of my past. It was a step toward healing. We sat there until the stars were bright and the air grew colder. He draped a blanket over my shoulders, and we shared quiet stories, some funny, some bittersweet. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't erase the pain I'd been through, but it felt real. As the night deepened, I realized that meeting Daniel by the lake wasn't just a coincidence. It was a lifeline I hadn't known I needed. He didn't try to fix me, and he didn't ask for more than I could give. He just showed up. And maybe that was what love was supposed to be, not grand gestures or promises that couldn't be kept, but someone who stayed, someone who listened. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. And as I leaned my head against Daniel's shoulder, watching the quiet ripples of the lake, I let myself believe, just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something beautiful. The morning sun poured through my windows, soft and golden. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't wake up with a hollow ache in my chest. Instead, I woke up with something fragile but hopeful, a sense of quiet belonging. Daniel had become part of my world in a way I hadn't expected. He was patient, steady, and present in ways I hadn't realized I needed. I wasn't naive, though. Falling for someone after what I'd been through felt dangerous, like standing on the edge of a cliff and trusting the wind not to push you over. But I was tired of being afraid. If love had taught me anything, it was that you could survive even the worst kind of heartbreak. And maybe, just maybe, you could find something beautiful on the other side of it. Daniel was proof of that. He showed up in ways Ethan never had. Whether it was random messages throughout the day asking how I was, or spontaneous walks where we'd talk for hours. He made me laugh again. He made me believe that I was worth loving, not despite my scars, but because of them. That morning, as I wrapped myself in a warm sweater and looked out the window at the calm street below, I felt ready. Ready to leave the past behind. Ready to build something new. I wasn't chasing perfection anymore, just something real. Later that afternoon, Daniel and I went for a walk by the river. The town was busy, full of people enjoying the weekend. The air was cool but fresh, carrying the scent of leaves and coffee from a nearby cafe. Daniel's hand was warm in mine, his thumb brushing softly against my skin as we walked. We talked about small things, favorite childhood memories, places we wanted to travel, the books I kept meaning to read but never did. It felt so easy, so natural, like the world had finally stopped spinning long enough for me to catch my breath. I glanced up at him and smiled, my heart swelling with a quiet kind of joy. And then I saw them, Ethan and Lily. It was like the world froze for a heartbeat. They were walking toward us, hand in hand, their heads close as they laughed at something I couldn't hear. The sight of them felt like a punch to the gut. I hadn't seen them together since that day, the day everything fell apart. I had tried to prepare myself for the inevitable moment when our paths would cross, but nothing could have prepared me for this. My grip on Daniel's hand tightened involuntarily. He noticed and glanced at me, concerned. "Emma?" I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe. "It's nothing," I muttered, though my heart was racing. I looked straight ahead, pretending they didn't exist. Maybe if I ignored them, this moment would pass like a bad dream. But, of course, it didn't. I saw Lily's face change the moment she noticed me. Her smile faltered, replaced by a look of uncertainty. Ethan followed her gaze and saw me too. There was something unreadable in his expression. Shock, guilt, maybe even shame. It didn't matter. I wasn't interested in deciphering him anymore. Lily hesitated for a second, then started toward me. "Emma," she called out, her voice light but cautious, as though trying to gauge whether I'd acknowledge her. My mind raced. Part of me wanted to scream, to demand answers I knew I'd never get. But a stronger part of me, the part that had grown from the ashes of their betrayal, refused to give her the satisfaction of thinking she still had any power over me. I kept walking. Daniel must have noticed the tension because he gently squeezed my hand, silently asking if I was okay. I nodded and pressed forward, as if Lily's voice was nothing more than the wind brushing past my ears. "Emma, wait!" She tried again, her steps quickening. I felt her presence just behind me, her shadow stretching toward mine. But I didn't stop. I wouldn't. Not for her, not for him. I'd spent too long letting them occupy space in my mind, turning over every lie, every betrayal, as though doing so would make sense of it all. But I was done with that. They didn't deserve my attention, my questions, or my pain. Daniel must have sensed the weight of the moment, because he gently tugged me to the side of the path. "Do you want to sit for a minute?" he asked softly. I glanced back for a fraction of a second, just long enough to see Lily stop in her tracks, uncertainty clouding her face. Ethan reached out, touching her arm to stop her from following me any further. His expression was tight, his eyes flickering with something that almost looked like regret. But I didn't care. Not anymore. "No," I said to Daniel, my voice steady even though my heart was still racing. "I don't want to stop." He searched my face for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, let's keep walking." And so we did. We walked past the pain, the betrayal, and the ghosts of who I'd been. I let their presence fade behind me like the remnants of a bad dream. Daniel didn't ask me to explain, and I loved him for that. He simply stayed by my side, grounding me with his quiet strength. Later that evening, after we'd returned home and the sky had turned dark, I curled up on the couch with a blanket and a cup of tea. Daniel sat next to me, flipping absent-mindedly through a book, but glancing at me every few minutes, as if checking to make sure I was okay. I broke the silence first. "I saw them today," I said quietly. Daniel looked up, his eyes soft. "I figured." I traced the rim of my teacup with my finger. "It didn't hurt the way I thought it would," I admitted. "It surprised me. I thought I'd fall apart." Daniel leaned in, resting his hand over mine. "That's because you've grown stronger than the person they broke." His words settled over me like a warm blanket. I smiled, a real, unburdened smile, and leaned against his shoulder. "You know," I murmured, "I used to think I'd never trust anyone again, that I'd always be scared of what came next." "And now?" he asked softly. I closed my eyes, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne. "Now, I want to keep walking forward." Daniel's arm wrapped around me, pulling me closer. "Then that's exactly what we'll do." The shadows of my past may have walked past me today, but they were behind me now. And with Daniel's hand in mine, I knew that the road ahead was mine to choose. I wasn't running anymore. I was moving forward, step by step, breath by breath, into a future I was finally ready to believe in. The sunlight was already streaming through the window when I woke up. The soft glow painted the room in golden hues, but something felt off. I blinked a few times, trying to clear the haze of sleep. It was almost noon, far later than I usually slept in. I rubbed my eyes and stretched, but the strange sensation in my chest didn't go away. That's when I noticed the open window. A soft breeze fluttered the curtains, carrying in the sounds of the street below. Birds chirping, distant traffic, the hum of everyday life. But I hadn't left the window open. I never did. My heart quickened as a small jolt of unease crept up my spine. I got out of bed slowly, my feet brushing against the cool floor as I made my way toward the door. The quiet of the apartment felt unnatural, like the air itself was holding its breath. I wasn't sure why, but every instinct in me screamed that something was about to happen. I padded down the hallway, my pulse thudding in my ears. When I reached the kitchen, I stopped dead in my tracks. Daniel was there. He was standing near the counter, his back to me. He didn't notice me at first. His hands were rifling through one of the drawers, as if he was looking for something. The clinking of metal against wood echoed faintly, and for a brief second, a terrifying thought pierced through my mind. Is he stealing from me? My heart sank, and a sharp, icy wave of fear gripped me. I took a step back, the floor creaking beneath my weight. Daniel froze. Slowly, he turned to face me, and the moment his eyes met mine, something shifted. "Emma," he said softly, his voice calm but laced with something. "Nervous?" "You're awake." I stared at him, confusion swirling in my chest. What are you doing?" My voice came out quieter than I intended. Daniel took a deep breath, his hands slipping behind his back as if he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't. For a terrifying moment, I thought he was going to try to explain it away, come up with some excuse that would shatter every bit of trust I'd built with him. But instead, he did something I didn't expect. He dropped to one knee. My breath caught in my throat. "Emma," he began, his eyes steady but filled with an earnestness that rooted me to the spot. I wasn't looking for anything to steal, I was looking for the right moment, but it turns out there's no such thing as perfect timing, just the courage to say what you feel before the chance slips away. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. My heart pounded in my chest, every emotion crashing into me all at once. Shock, fear, disbelief, and something warmer, something I hadn't let myself hope for. He opened the box, revealing a simple but stunning ring, a silver band with a small, brilliant diamond at its center. The light caught the edges of the stone, making it shimmer. "I love you," Daniel said, his voice unwavering. "From the moment I met you by the lake, I knew there was something special about you, something worth fighting for. You've been through so much, and I know trust doesn't come easy anymore. But I promise you, I'm here to stay. No lies, no betrayals, just us." Tears welled up in my eyes, blurring my vision. I wasn't sure what to say. I felt like I was standing in the middle of a story I hadn't expected to be mine. After everything I'd been through, after all the cracks and scars left behind by Ethan and Lily, here was Daniel, holding out not just a ring, but a new beginning. A chance to rewrite what love meant to me. Daniel smiled, though his hands trembled slightly. "Emma, will you marry me?" The room was so still that I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant chatter of the world outside the window, and my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. I swallowed hard, trying to find my voice through the knot of emotion lodged in my throat. "Daniel," I whispered, stepping closer until I was standing right in front of him. He looked up at me with such hope, such vulnerability, that it broke something inside me. Not in a painful way, but in a way that felt like healing. I hesitated, not because I didn't love him, but because the weight of the question was so monumental. Marriage wasn't just a promise, it was a leap of faith, and I knew exactly how far that leap could hurt if you fell. But as I looked into Daniel's eyes, all I could see was the truth, the quiet, steady love that had been there since the beginning. "I don't need perfect timing," I said, my voice trembling but sure. "I just need you." His eyes widened for a moment before softening with relief. "Is that a yes?" he asked, a hopeful smile spreading across his face. I nodded, tears spilling down my cheeks as I laughed through them. "Yes," I whispered. "Yes." Daniel stood and pulled me into his arms, holding me as if I might slip away if he let go. His warmth wrapped around me, and for the first time in so long, I felt completely safe. The past no longer felt like a shadow over us. It felt distant, something I'd survived but no longer belonged to. When he finally pulled back, he slipped the ring onto my finger, his hand steady despite the emotion written all over his face. It fit perfectly, like it had been waiting for me all along. "I can't promise that life will always be easy," Daniel murmured, brushing a tear from my cheek. "But I can promise that I'll be here, no matter what." I smiled, threading my fingers through his. "That's all I need." We stood there in the quiet kitchen, the sunlight streaming in and warming the room around us. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. I was ready. The future was uncertain, as it always is. But now, I knew one thing for sure. Love wasn't about never falling. It was about finding someone who was willing to catch you when you did. And as Daniel kissed me, soft and steady, I felt the pieces of myself finally come together, whole once more. Life felt like a dream, one I never wanted to wake up from. Every morning, I woke up to the scent of freshly brewed coffee and the soft clinking of dishes. Daniel would walk in with a tray, a warm smile on his face, messy hair, and sleepy eyes. Breakfast in bed had become our tradition. Buttery croissants, fresh fruit, and scrambled eggs seasoned just the way I liked them. "Good morning, beautiful," he'd say as he set the tray down and kissed my forehead. No matter how many times he said it, I always blushed, my heart fluttering in my chest. I had spent so long thinking love was fragile, something that could only bring pain. But Daniel showed me that love could be gentle, steady, kind. Our days were filled with laughter, late-night movies, spontaneous picnics by the lake, and slow dances in the kitchen to old jazz songs. I never felt like I was chasing happiness anymore. It was right there, in every small moment we shared. He made me feel like I was living in the pages of a storybook, but this time, it was real. But Daniel was full of surprises. One morning, as we lay in bed after breakfast, he rested his head on my shoulder and smiled up at me. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you." I raised an eyebrow, curious. "Oh? Should I be worried?" He laughed softly and shook his head. "Not at all, but I think it's time you knew I'm not exactly who you think I am." My heart skipped a beat. "Daniel, what do you mean?" He propped himself up on one elbow, his eyes sparkling with a mix of nerves and excitement. "I didn't want you to know at first because I needed to be sure that what we had was real, but I'm not just some guy who likes quiet lakes and wine picnics. Emma, I own a company. I've built it from the ground up, and I'm actually worth quite a bit." I blinked, stunned. "Wait, are you saying you're a millionaire?" He chuckled at my wide-eyed expression. "Technically, yes, but that's not the point. The point is, I wanted you to love me, not what I have, and you do. That's why I'm telling you now." I stared at him, processing his words. "So, the wine, the picnics, everything was a test?" "Not a test," he said softly, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. "A chance for us to just be ourselves, without anything else getting in the way. I didn't want you to think I was trying to buy your love." I felt a wave of emotion swell in my chest. I reached up, cupping his face in my hands. "Daniel, I don't care about any of that. You could be a billionaire or a barista. It wouldn't matter. I love you for who you are, not what you have." His eyes softened, and he leaned in, pressing his forehead against mine. "I know. That's why you're the only person I've ever wanted to share my life with." I kissed him, slow and tender, my heart full to the brim. Daniel had given me the kind of love I never thought I'd find, the kind that didn't come with conditions or fears, only trust and joy. But fate had one more twist in store. One afternoon, as I was curled up on the couch with a book, my phone buzzed on the table. I reached for it absently, assuming it was a message from Daniel. But when I saw the name on the screen, my stomach dropped. Lily. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the screen. I hadn't spoken to her since the day I walked away by the river. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to protect the peace I'd finally built. But something told me this wasn't a call I could ignore. I took a deep breath and answered, "Hello?" My voice was wary but calm. There was a pause, followed by the sound of soft, shuddering breaths. "Emma." Lily's voice was barely recognizable, fragile, broken. I didn't know who else to call. I sat up straighter, my heart tightening in my chest. "Lily, what's wrong?" She let out a sob that made my stomach twist. "The baby. She's here. I had her last night, but Ethan left. He left me, Emma. He just walked out, said he couldn't handle it." I closed my eyes, the weight of her words pressing down on me. Ethan. Of course he had. He had always been a coward, running away from responsibility the moment things became inconvenient for him. But hearing Lily like this, so vulnerable and afraid, made my heart ache. For all the pain she'd caused me, I couldn't ignore the fact that she was human. And now, she was alone. "Lily, I'm so sorry," I whispered, unsure of what else to say. "I was stupid," she cried. I thought we'd be a family. I thought he'd change. But he didn't." She paused, taking a ragged breath. "I don't deserve your help. I know that. But I didn't know who else to call." Her words hung in the air, raw and desperate. I felt Daniel's presence before I saw him. He must have heard the conversation from the other room. He sat down next to me, his hand resting gently over mine. His silent support grounded me, reminded me of how far I'd come. "Lily," I said after a moment, my voice steady but soft. "I'm not sure what you want me to do, but I'll listen, and if you need someone to talk to, I'm here." She broke down again, her cries muffled through the phone. "Thank you," she whispered through her tears. "I don't deserve it, but thank you." We spoke for a few more minutes before she finally calmed down. I offered her the name of a counselor and reassured her that she wasn't alone, even if Ethan had abandoned her. When the call ended, I let out a long breath and leaned into Daniel's shoulder. He wrapped his arms around me, holding me close. "You're incredible, you know that?" he murmured. I smiled weakly. "I don't know about that." "You are," he insisted. "You had every right to turn your back on her, but you didn't. You chose kindness." I closed my eyes, soaking in his warmth. I guess I just know what it feels like to be left behind. Daniel kissed the top of my head and whispered, "You'll never be alone again, Emma. Not as long as I'm here." In that moment, I knew that I'd finally found peace, not because life was perfect, but because I'd finally chosen love over fear, kindness over bitterness, and strength over resentment. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free. The weeks that followed felt surreal, like stepping into a new chapter where everything finally aligned. I had faced the shadows of my past and chosen to walk forward into the light. And for the first time, life felt beautifully simple, not because it was perfect, but because I was finally at peace with who I was and where I was going. Daniel and I spent our days making plans for the future, not the distant, impossible kind, but the kind rooted in quiet, everyday joys. We talked about where we'd live, the places we'd visit, and how we wanted to fill our lives with moments that mattered. I wasn't haunted by Lily's call anymore. In fact, something strange happened after that conversation. I stopped thinking of her as the woman who ruined everything and started seeing her as someone who had made mistakes, just like me. It didn't mean we'd ever be best friends again, but I'd let go of the bitterness that had weighed me down for so long. Forgiveness wasn't for her. It was for me. One sunny afternoon, Daniel and I returned to the lake where everything had started. The air was fresh, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers. The water shimmered in the sunlight, calm and steady, like a reflection of how I felt inside. He spread out a blanket on the grass, and we settled down, sharing a bottle of wine and a container of strawberries. I laughed as Daniel tried to balance his glass in the uneven grass, muttering under his breath about how nature wasn't meant for wine glasses. "Here," I said, holding mine up. "We'll toast to imperfection." He chuckled and clinked his glass against mine. "To imperfection," he repeated, his eyes crinkling at the corners with that familiar warmth. We sipped in comfortable silence, watching the soft ripples dance across the surface of the water. After a while, Daniel set his glass down and turned to me, his expression soft but serious. "You know," he began, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear, "I used to come to this lake to clear my head when everything in my life felt overwhelming. I thought I was coming here to be alone. But then I found you." My heart swelled at his words. "You were the first person who made me feel like I didn't have to carry everything on my own," he continued, his voice low and steady. "You reminded me that love doesn't have to be complicated or painful. It can be simple and beautiful." I reached for his hand, lacing my fingers through his. "You did the same for me," I whispered. "You taught me that love doesn't have to come with fear." He smiled, and for a while, we just sat there, hand in hand, soaking in the moment. A few weeks later, the wedding day arrived. Our wedding day. It wasn't the grand, lavish event that I'd once envisioned. It was something better, small, intimate, and filled with the people who mattered most. The ceremony was held outdoors, under a canopy of trees, with the soft rustling of leaves as our backdrop. I wore a simple white dress that moved like water when I walked, and Daniel looked effortlessly handsome in a tailored navy suit. His eyes never left mine as I walked down the aisle, and in that moment, nothing else existed. When I reached him, he took my hands in his, and the world seemed to quiet. The officiant began speaking, but I barely registered the words. I was too focused on the way Daniel looked at me, as though I was the only thing in the universe. When it was time to exchange vows, Daniel took a deep breath and smiled softly. "Emma," he began, his voice steady but full of emotion, "you are my calm in the storm, my reason to believe in the beauty of second chances. I promise to love you not just for who you are today, but for who you'll become. I'll be by your side, no matter where life takes us, no matter how imperfect it gets. I'm yours. Always." Tears welled up in my eyes as I held his hands tighter. I took a deep breath before speaking. "Daniel, you showed me that love doesn't have to be something you survive. It can be something that heals you. You make me feel seen, safe, and endlessly loved. I promise to choose you every day, through every high and low, with all that I am. You're my home, and I'm yours. Always." The officiant smiled. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Daniel, you may kiss your bride." He didn't hesitate. He pulled me close, his hands gentle but sure, and kissed me as though the world had melted away. The crowd around us erupted into cheers, but all I could feel was the steady beat of Daniel's heart against mine. The reception was simple, but beautiful. There was a small white tent set up near the clearing, strung with fairy lights that twinkled as the sun began to set. We danced barefoot on the grass, laughing as Daniel spun me in circles until I was dizzy. The music swirled around us, soft and romantic, the perfect soundtrack to our story. I caught a glimpse of Lily standing off to the side, holding her baby girl in her arms. She looked different, quieter, gentler. Our eyes met across the distance, and for a moment time seemed to slow. She nodded once, a small, sad smile on her lips, and I nodded back. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was closure, a silent acknowledgement of everything we'd been through. Daniel wrapped his arms around my waist, pulling me close. "You okay?" he asked, his voice warm and low. I smiled up at him, feeling lighter than I'd ever felt. "I'm more than okay," I said. "I'm happy." He kissed the top of my head, and we swayed to the music, our future stretched out before us like an unwritten song. I knew there would still be challenges ahead. There always are. But I also knew that love wasn't about avoiding the storms. It was about finding someone who would stand in the rain with you, hand in hand, until the clouds cleared. And as the stars began to fill the sky, I held on to Daniel and whispered a quiet promise to myself. This time, love would be everything it was meant to be. My story didn't end in heartbreak. It ended in hope and a love that felt like coming home.